Good morning, Sir Tesoro. Good morning, classmate. Our first topic to be discussed in literary criticism approaches are biographical and cultural criticism. What is biographical? It is an adjective, came from the Greek word means of data or written work dealing with a particular person's life. Example, biographical books on the Beatles. Biographical criticism is a form of literary criticism which analyzes a writer's biography to show the relationship between the author's life and their works of literature. It is often associated with historical biographical criticism, a critical method that sees a literary work chiefly, if not exclusively, as a reflection of its author's life and times. On the timeline of biographical criticism, it starts as early as Renaissance period, around 14th century, and then followed by the disapproval of new critics in 19th century. And on 20th century, it remains a significant mode of biography inquiry. This long-standing critical method dates back at least to the Renaissance period, was employed extensively by Samuel Johnson in his Lives of the Poets in 1779 to 1781. It was possibly the first thorough-going exercise in biographical criticism. As early as the 19th century, this would be the origin of the disapproval of the scholars or the against of biographical criticism that considered the literary against its background of author's biography. The aim was to find references to the author's life, education, and sociocultural environment in a literary work. Ever since the French critic Roland Barthes announced the death of the author in 1968, the biographical approach has lost its appeal for many scholars. Barthes and critics following him have argued that an author's biography is irrelevant since the meaning of the text only emerges in the reading process, and the reader thus becomes the real author of the text. He writes, for example, of a photograph of his mother. On the photography, that he had found his mother's face, that the face he had loved. In the photograph, it describes the photograph was very old. The corners were blunted from having been pasted into an album. The sepia print had faded. This example, personalized style characteristic of the little Barthes, confirmed the semiotician and literary critic as a writer in his own right. Barthes writes the novelistic without the novel, as he himself put it. Indeed, this is arguably the true basis of his originality, over and above his theories of writing and signification. Thus, in A Lover's Discourse, Barthes says that we do not know who is speaking. The text speaks, that is all. Disapproval continues in 19th century. Like any other critical methodology, biographical criticism can be used with discretion and insight or employed as a superficial shortcut to understanding the literary work on its own terms through such strategies as formalism. Hence, 19th century biographical criticism came under disapproval by the so-called new critics in 1920. This new criticism wishes to emphasize the artworks should be interpreted and assessed as constructed artifacts rather than expressions of the emotions or specific individual. According to them, they coined it as a term as biographical policy to describe the criticism that neglected the imaginative genesis of literature. What is biographical policy? It is the fallacy term used in cultural criticism to critique the new or the view of works of creative art, literature, or music that can be interpreted as reflection of the life of their authors. And according to James Thomas, this type of approach distances itself from the play that goes instead in the playwright's biography to find people, places, and things that seems to be similar to the picture in the play. In its extreme form of this policy, because it does not consider the playwrights use their imagination when they write and that they can imagine improbable or even impossible things. Robert S. Miola, professor of English at Loyola College in Maryland, discusses the biographical policy as the unqualified conviction that one can read the author's life from the work and vice versa, and adds, this policy is widespread in Shakespeare study, true enough, but the business of wrenching passages out of dramatic context as evidence of the playwright's personal beliefs usually reveals more about the critic than about Shakespeare. Amidst of the disapproval of the new criticism with the new critics and formalism, others considered in 1963 the term offensive and defend this biographical criticism approach in its non-extreme forms, finding that full understanding of an author's works is not possible without extrinsic sources, which is essential or the essential sources. Leon Edel, in his book Literary Biography, devoted a chapter to defend biographical criticism, while admitting the excess of certain earlier critics' use of biography. He rigorously stated that no critic, I hold, can explicate the very word implies this anything without alluding to something else, which is outside the work of literature. The earlier 20th century, biographical criticism remained a significant mode of biography inquiry. Notwithstanding this critique, it has remained the most literary inquiry throughout the 20th century, particularly in studies of Charles Dickens, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and among others writers. Methods continues to employed in the study of such authors as John Steinbeck, Walt Whitman, and William Shakespeare. There is what we call peripatetic biographical criticism, which calls a peripatetic, which is traveling from place to place, in particular working or based in various places for a relatively short period. In the Cambridge History of Literary Criticism, Classical Criticism, in a chapter titled Peripatetic Biographical Criticism, George Alexander Kennedy notes that in the Hellenistic age, the earlier Greek time and classical period of Greece, the works of authors were read as sources of information about their lives, personalities, and interests. Because by that time, all of these Greek authors all focused to their attitude, to their needs, to their finding the knowledge and ideas, those philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle. Some of their materials then used by the other commentators and critics to explain passages in their works, being the classical and first foundation of literary written works. This process became a circular one in that, though peripatetic biographers utilizes external evidences were available, they had little to go on and query the text for hints. According to Jackson J. Benson about the recognition of otherness, which is described as the form that there is an author who is different in personality and background from the reader and appears to be simple-minded proposition. So the exploration of otherness is what literary biography and biographical criticism can do best. Discovering an author as a unique individual, a discovery that puts a burden on us to reach out to recognize that uniqueness before we can fully comprehend an author's writing. As a broader sense of biographical criticism in literary criticism, it is also connected to the other criticism like this new historicism. It interests in the fact that all literary works are situated in a specific historical and biographical context from which they are generated. New historicism is a literary theory based on the idea that literature should be studied and interpreted within the context of both the history of the author and the history of the critic. It rejects the concept that literary study should be limited to the internal or formal characteristic of a literary work, and insists that it is properly includes in a knowledge of a context which the work was created. Biographical criticism also connected and stands in ambiguous relationship to romanticism. It is often argued that it is the development from romanticism, but it also stands in opposition to the romantic tendency to view literature as manifesting a universal transcendence of the particular condition of its genesis. Romanticism actually is the attitude or intellect orientation that characterized many works of literature, painting, music, and historiography in Western civilization over a period of late 18th to 19th century. And it emphasized the individual, subjective, the irrational, the imaginative, the personal, the spontaneous and emotional and visionary and also transcendental, wherein romanticism deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature, the general exaltation of emotion over the reason, the senses over intellect, a turning point upon the self and the heightened examination of human personality and its mood and mental potentialities, a preoccupation with the genius and hero, the exemptional figure in general and focus with the fashion and inner struggles that also within the uh, human nature of a writer or the character in the story. There are advantages or three benefits of using biographical criticism in a literary pieces, not just like the disadvantages which also the topic of disapproval in the 19th century that I have discussed a while ago, which is also the biographical policy. These advantages benefits the criticism in knowing the author's experiences that can help a reader decide how to interpret a text. And the next, a reader can better appreciate a text by knowing a writer's struggles or difficulties in creating that text. It is just like they better understand the writer's struggle or how the reader mirrored the author's life to his work. And last, the reader can understand a writer's preoccupation by studying the way they apply and modify their own life experiences in their works. There are example questions to biographical approach. These are just example, but we can add also and we can modify these questions upon reading a novel or short story. So these examples are What aspects of the author's personal lives are relevant to the story? Second, which of the author's stated beliefs are reflected in the work? Third, does a writer challenge or support the values of her contemporaries? Fourth, what seems to be the author's major concerns? Do they reflect any of the writer's personal experiences? Do any of the events of the story corresponds to events experienced by the author? And last, do any of the characters in the story corresponds to real people? This is the example of biographical criticism used in the novel published of Lord of the Flies in 1954, written by William Golding, and is also awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1983. So allow me to read the criticism written and I've gathered and researched online. As a young boy, William Golding acted as a bully in his elementary school. He even confessed that he enjoyed hurting people. This same drive to inflict pain upon others reflects itself in the majority of the vegans on the island. Vegans are those people who are big enough. Golding also stated that he has always enjoyed Nazis because I'm of that sort of nature. Jack and his group of hunters share similar characteristics to the Nazis in the way they seize power and create a scapegoat. The Began's method of thoughts of hurting others exhibit Golding's own thoughts. Mr. Carey, the author of William Golding, the man who wrote The Lord of the Flies, wrote that Golding was scared of being alone in the night, as were the Littons. This fear creates the idea of the beast, the driving force for the boys to become even more savage and uncivilized while growing up. Golding often mocked his father's view of rationalism and believed that our world can be understood through reasoning. The character Piggy exemplifies this belief, while all the characters at one point or another become his foil. When the hunters murdered the level-headed Piggy, Golding proves that basic human nature opposes the ideals of rationalism. In 1940, Golding joined the Royal Navy to fight for 5 years in World War II. He created both plot events and characters in Lord of the Flies that parallel the Holocaust. For example, Jack compares to Hitler in his seizure of power, promised food and a better life, and his development of scapegoat, the beast. These methods in the quote, I gave you food, and my hunters will protect you from the beast, who will be in my tribe, succeed in drawing out of shadows of the boys on the island until they are ruled by their drive to hunt and kill. After the war, Golding had two children, a boy and a girl. His son had a mental illness and his daughter also had troubles growing up. This fueled his lack of faith in humanity. Man produces evil, as bee produces honey. Even in something as pure as child, this thought of an inner evil within us played a vital role in his novel. As children on the islands possess sinful thoughts and plan to corrupt plot. Cultural criticism is another literary criticism approach that is relating to the ideas, custom, and social behavior of a society. If we talk about society, we are talking about a group of people. So, people, the history of people, the biographical of these human beings. Cultural criticism is a literary theory that challenges the artificial distinction between the high and low culture. This distinction is based on what is believed to be the traditional and worthy elements in a particular culture. Cultural criticism or studies is defined in different ways for different purposes. Some of assumption will be pulled from anthropology, and some of literary studies. Anthropology would lead to deem a literature anthology as a cultural artifact that tells us something about the rites, ritual, language, and understanding of a certain type of culture. We can begin to explore what is natural to all humans against how culture inscribes beliefs, values, custom, taboos, laws, and materials production to meet. Understanding culture is a broad sense of understanding human behavior and also the society. So in this table below is the beginning of understanding culture that no more natural and cultural right that seems to be individual within the group. The more we can consider the individual as an insider to culture. uh, when we talk about the difference of death and the rites and rituals for observation of passing for the cultural basis of different nations. Let's say the sex, uh, the control through marriage rights. So, if the better example of this is the same-sex marriage, something like that. Example is the color of skin, hair, and so on, which is determined characteristic of the group of people based on these things. Who are they? What they why they are differ from each other. And then the ability to learn language. And for the cultural basis, the language actually learned and used. Like biographical criticism I've discussed a while ago, cultural criticism shares also much of beliefs of new historical criticism. That is often too difficult to distinguish the two critical literary theories one from another. Both are interdisciplinary and anti-disciplinary, that in both argue that human experience, which is the stuff of human history and culture, cannot be adequately understood by means of academic discipline that curve up into such artificially separated categories such as sociology, psychology, literature, and so forth. In this sense, it is what we call the cultural criticism broads and transcends with the reasons of sociology and psychology that differs from other nations. If we base this criticism in a short story, you have to digger deep the human history of that certain author or people in the story itself where they came from. This literary approach focuses more on politics in general and supports oppressed and marginalized peoples, events, and historical moments by drawing on varied political theories such as Marxism, feminism, and postcolonial American and African criticism. Cultural critics believes culture is a process, not a product. It is lived experience, not a fixed definition. Precisely, a culture is a collection of interactive cultures, each of which is growing and changing, each of which is constituted at a given moment in time by the intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, occupation, and similar factors that contributes to the experience of its members, and also analyzes the popular culture in all of its varied forms. In literature, they often look closely at the similarities and differences between the work and its adapted screenplay or movie. It's the cultural critic's duty to determine the ways in which the popular version transforms the ideological content of a novel. In this sense, this is the very example why the novel differs from the movie or screenplay itself, or why the novel is differs from the theater play because these cultural critics modifies which is the better for the audience and the listeners. This is an example of cultural criticism. The novel written by American writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, the sets in the Jazz Age on Long Island. The novel depicts the narrator Nick Carraway interactions with mysterious millionaire Jay Gatsby and Gatsby's obsession to reunite with his former lover Daisy Buchanan. Allow me to read the short's criticism. As a great literary work, The Great Gatsby's meaning needs to be interpreted in context of the history and culture in which it is written or it was written at the culture in which we live today, because our interpretation is biased and subjective as part of our cultural conditioning and ideologies. Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby at that time when people really believed a person could raise their own station in life and achieve limitless success. It was an era full of men and achieving the rags to riches lifestyle. The idea of self-made man was proven possibly by millionaires like John D. Rockefeller, Jay Gould, Jim Fess, Andre Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Philip Armour, and James J. H. Hill. Circulating throughout society were numerous workouts that describe how with determination, hard work, and perseverance anybody could become rich and successful. Because character rather than education or business acumen was considered the foundation of the self-made man. The ascendance of Jay Gatsby from his poor childhood as James Gatz to the rich and powerful protagonist of the novel mirrored the contemporary discourses of the era. But despite his accomplishment, Gatsby tries to deny his past, to abolish his true identity in the wake of new persona as Jay Gatsby, and in the way the novel strives to escape history and transcend the historical realities of time, place, and human limitation. Understanding the complex meaning within Great Gatsby requires a broad understanding of its historical and cultural context, which is the aim of these critical literary theories. And also to add, I've also researched that this story also is perfect in the biographical criticism because Great Gatsby also mirrored the life of F. Scott Fitzgerald that also chases the riches of that time or that era. That's all of my report about the biographical and cultural studies. Thank you for listening and stay safe. Thank you and God bless.